The execution courtyard of Aethelgard was paved with black cobblestones that absorbed the weak winter sunlight, leaving nothing but a vast, freezing expanse of stone. It was a place designed for finality. At the center of the square stood the wooden scaffold, elevated high enough so that every citizen, every noble, and every terrified servant could witness the price of treason against the crown. The wooden planks groaned softly under the weight of the massive iron block. The air smelled of wood smoke frost and the sharp, undeniable scent of impending death. On the high balcony overlooking the courtyard, King Alaric stood like a statue carved from midnight granite. He wore his heavy ceremonial armor, the dark steel absorbing the cold, his heavy velvet cloak sweeping over the stone ledge. Beside him stood Eleanor. She was no longer dressed in the plain woolen robes of a forgotten cast out. She wore a gown of rich dark crimson silk, the color of royal vengeance, with a heavy mantle of black wolf fur draped over her shoulders. The court stood meticulously arranged behind them, absolutely silent, their breaths pluming in the freezing air like nervous ghosts. Just weeks ago, these same aristocrats had laughed at Eleanor in the grand corridors. They had watched her endure the ultimate humiliation at the wedding altar. Now they did not dare to look directly at her. She stood shoulder to shoulder with the king, possessing a terrifying, icy calm that made the hardened generals of the realm deeply uneasy. The heavy iron portcullis at the far end of the courtyard screeched upward, the sound echoing off the stone walls like a scream. Lord Stirling was led out. He was stripped of his fine velvet coats and silver chains. He wore a ragged linen tunic that offered no protection against the biting wind. His hands were bound heavily with iron shackles, the chains dragging across the black cobblestones with a rhythmic, damning clatter. Flanked by 4 massive royal guards in full plate armor, the architect of the wedding deception looked frail, broken, and entirely stripped of his arrogant polish. Eleanor watched her uncle walk toward the scaffold. Her spine was completely straight, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. The corset beneath her silk gown was pulled tight, restricting her breath, but she did not allow her chest to heave. This was the man who had kept her locked in the dark wings of the Stirling estate for 20 years. This was the man who had shoved her into a carriage, threatened her with the debtor's prison, and forced her to stand before a furious king to absorb the wrath meant for him. Alaric glanced at her from the corner of his eye. He noticed the absolute stillness of her posture, the terrifying absence of pity in her stormy gray eyes. He felt a surge of dark, protective pride. She was born to stand on this balcony. The executioner, a towering figure clad in black leather with a hood obscuring his face, stood waiting beside the block. His massive, double-bladed axe rested against the wood, catching a single, cruel glint of the winter sun. Lord Stirling was forced up the wooden stairs. His knees buckled near the top, and a guard roughly hauled him up by the chains, shoving him toward the block. The high magistrate stepped to the edge of the platform, unrolling a heavy parchment sealed with black wax.
"Lord Julian Stirling,"
the magistrate's voice boomed, amplified by the high stone walls of the courtyard.
"you have been found guilty of high treason against the crown of Valerius.
You conspired with foreign interests to deceive the king at the sacred altar. You sought to destabilize the throne through fraud and manipulation. By the decree of His Majesty King Alaric, your lands are forfeit, your name is stricken from the high registry, and your life is required to balance the scales of justice." The magistrate rolled the parchment back up. The silence that fell over the courtyard was absolute and suffocating.
"Do you have any final words before the gods?"
the magistrate asked, stepping back. It was a formality. Traitors usually wept, begged for mercy, or remained paralyzed by terror. But Lord Stirling did not weep. Slowly, painfully, he lifted his head. His face was bruised and gaunt from his days in the black cells, but his eyes burned with a sudden manic, terrified fire. He did not look at the executioner. He did not look at the magistrate. He turned his head and looked directly up at the high balcony, locking eyes with the king. And then Lord Stirling began to laugh. It was a horrific, broken sound, a dry, rasping cackle that sent a collective shudder through the ranks of the nobility watching from above. The executioner shifted his grip on the axe, unsettled by the raw madness in the sound. Alaric's jaw tightened. He leaned his hands against the stone balustrade, his dark eyes narrowing into lethal slits. "Silence him," Alaric commanded, his voice a low, carrying rumble. A guard stepped forward to force Sterling's head down onto the block, but the old lord suddenly thrashed wildly against his chains, throwing himself backward with a burst of frantic strength. "You think you have won, Alaric?" Sterling screamed, his voice tearing at his throat, echoing violently off the high obsidian walls. "You think you execute a traitor today to secure your stolen crown? You arrogant, blind fool!" A collective gasp ripped through the nobles on the balcony. To insult the king on the execution block was madness. Eleanor felt a sudden sharp prick of ice slide down her spine. Her uncle was a coward. Cowards did not taunt warlords unless they held a weapon they believed could destroy them. "Force him to the block!" the commander of the guard shouted from below. Two guards grabbed Sterling's shoulders, but he twisted his eyes, snapping from Alaric to Eleanor. The manic fire in his gaze shifted into something deeply venomous, something that had been hidden in the dark for 2 decades. "You call her a false queen!" Sterling roared, the words echoing with terrifying clarity. "You almost cast her into the streets because you thought she was my worthless blood. You thought House Thorn played a trick on you, Alaric, but the gods played a trick on us all." Alaric raised his hand, a sharp cutting motion. The guards below instantly froze, holding Sterling firmly, but keeping his head off the block. The king's combat instincts flared. Information was a weapon, and Sterling was about to detonate one. "What trick, Sterling?" Alaric demanded, his voice cold enough to freeze the blood in the courtyard. "Speak your lies quickly before you lose the tongue that forms them." Sterling coughed, blood spattering his ragged tunic, but his terrifying smile remained. "She is not my niece. She does not have a drop of Sterling blood in her veins. My sister was barren. She never had a child." The courtyard fell into a deathly, ringing silence. Eleanor's breath hitched just once. The cold air suddenly felt too thin to breathe. She stared down at the man who had raised her in the shadows, the man who had treated her like a shameful secret. Asterisk, not his niece. The words did not compute. They hovered in the air like a foreign language. "Then who is she?" Alaric's voice was dangerously quiet, yet every person in the square heard it. Sterling fell to his knees on the wooden scaffold, the iron chains rattling loudly. He looked up at Eleanor, his face twisting with a mixture of hatred and awe.
"Look at her eyes, Alaric,"
Sterling sneered, his voice dropping to a raspy shout. "Look at the gray storm in her eyes. Look at the arrogant, unbroken spine of her. You know those eyes. You fought beside the man who had them." Alaric froze. Beside him, Eleanor felt the king's massive, imposing presence go entirely rigid. 22 years ago," Sterling gasped, fighting the guards who tried to press him down. "Before your older brother, Crown Prince Valerian, was killed in the border wars. He fell in love with a commoner from the lower city, a seamstress. He married her in secret beneath the stars, away from the eyes of the High Council. When Valerian died on the battlefield, the council ordered the girl killed to erase the shame. But my sister, she was the seamstress's midwife. She stole the baby from the bloody sheets before the assassins arrived. We hid her. We buried her true name to protect our own house from the council's wrath." The words struck the high balcony like a barrage of artillery fire. The nobles began to murmur violently, stepping back, exchanging horrified, frantic glances. Eleanor felt the heavy cobblestones of reality shattering beneath her feet. Her fingers gripped the stone ledge of the balcony so hard, her knuckles turned entirely white. Prince Valerian, the beloved heir, the true king of Aethelgard, who had died too soon, forcing his younger brother Alaric to take up a crown he was never meant to wear. "She is not a false queen, Alaric," Sterling screamed, laughing again, the sound bouncing off the walls like a curse. "She is Eleanor Valerius. She is the legitimate daughter of the crown prince. You did not marry a pawn. You married the true heir to the Iron Throne." The silence that followed was apocalyptic. Every single head in the courtyard, every guard, every aristocrat on the balcony slowly, terrifyingly turned to look at Eleanor. The woman they had mocked, the woman they had isolated in the drafty East Wing, the woman the king had promised to banish, was the rightful sovereign of the entire kingdom. Alaric stood frozen, his dark eyes locked onto the profile of the woman standing beside him. The crown of dark steel on his head suddenly felt unbearably heavy, forged from a lie he had never known he was telling. He looked at her stormy gray eyes, the aristocratic sharpness of her jaw, the terrifying dignity she had displayed since the moment she walked down the cathedral aisle. It wasn't just strength, it was royalty. Eleanor did not look at Alaric. She looked down at the scaffold, her heart pounding against her ribs with the violence of a trapped bird. 20 years of living as a ghost. 20 years of believing she was a burden, a cast-out a stain on the world. And it was all a cage designed to keep the true dragon in the dark. "Kill me!" Sterling roared from the block, laying his head down on the iron willingly. "Kill me, Alaric, but you can never execute the truth. The crown on your head belongs to her." Alaric's hands gripped the balcony. The world he had conquered, the kingdom he had violently held together, was unraveling at his feet. If this was true, his entire reign was illegitimate. If this was true, the woman he had just begun to love was his greatest threat. The executioner looked up at the balcony, waiting for the final nod. The crowd held its breath, waiting for the king to silence the treason forever. Alaric stared at the execution block. Then his voice cut through the winter air, absolute and earth-shattering. "Stay the axe!" The command tore through the freezing air like a physical blade, shattering the suffocating tension of the courtyard. "Stay the axe!" The executioner froze, his massive arms locked in place, the heavy double-bladed weapon hovering mere inches above Lord Sterling's exposed neck. For a fraction of a second, the courtyard remained perfectly, terrifyingly still. Then it erupted. The immaculate discipline of the Aethelgard nobility disintegrated into absolute chaos. Lords shouted in outrage and terror. Ladies-in-waiting shrieked, and the heavy boots of the royal guard clattered violently against the cobblestones as they rushed to form a perimeter around the scaffold. The secret that had been buried in blood for 2 decades had just been detonated in the open air. On the high balcony, King Alaric did not hesitate. The paralyzing shock lasted only a heartbeat before the ruthless instincts of a warlord took over. "Silas!" Alaric's voice roared over the din, vibrating with a dark, lethal authority. The commander of the guard instantly snapped to attention below. "Clear the square. Drive them out. Anyone who speaks a single syllable of what was said here today loses their tongue before nightfall. Gag the prisoner and bring him to the Chamber of Echoes. Now." Alaric turned sharply. He did not wait for his retinue. He stepped toward Eleanor. She was standing frozen by the stone ledge, her stormy gray eyes wide, staring at the empty space where her entire reality had just collapsed. Her breathing was shallow, restricted by the tight lacing of her corset and the crushing weight of the revelation. Alaric did not offer her his arm as a husband would. He reached out and wrapped his large, heavily armored hand firmly around her wrist. It was not a gesture of violence, but an anchor, a solid, undeniable grip pulling her back from the edge of the abyss. "Walk with me," Alaric commanded softly. His voice meant only for her. "Do not let them see you falter. You are Valerius." The name sent a violent shiver down her spine. Valerius, the blood of kings. Eleanor lifted her chin, calling upon the impenetrable armor of dignity that had kept her alive in the shadows. She nodded once. Together they turned their backs on the screaming nobility and walked away. The Chamber of Echoes was buried deep beneath the foundations of the royal palace. It was a cavernous room, entirely carved from black bedrock, built by the first kings of Aethelgard to interrogate traitors, where not even the gods could hear their screams. The air down here was thick-smelling of damp earth rust and ancient fear. The only light came from heavily iron-sconced torches that cast long, distorted shadows against the jagged walls. The heavy iron door slammed shut with a sound like a thunderclap, sealing them in absolute isolation. Lord Sterling was thrown violently onto the cold stone floor by Commander Silas, who immediately stepped outside to guard the door. Sterling groaned, his bound hands scraping against the rock. He was coughing up blood, but the manic, triumphant smile never left his battered face. Alaric stood over him. The king had removed his crown, tossing the heavy ring of dark steel and diamonds onto a wooden interrogation table, as if it suddenly burned his hands. He looked like a predator cornered in the dark.
"You have made a catastrophic accusation, Sterling,"
Alaric snarled, his voice dropping into a register so dark it made the torchlight seem to flicker.
You have publicly challenged the legitimacy of my throne. If this is a desperate, pathetic lie to save your neck from the block, I will not simply execute you. I will flay you alive."
Sterling spat a mouthful of blood onto the bedrock. He pushed himself up until he was resting against the cold wall, looking up at the furious king.
"I am a dead man either way. Alaric," Sterling wheezed, his chest heaving, "the High Council will assassinate me before the sun sets for revealing their greatest sin. I did not speak to save my life. I spoke to destroy yours." "Words are wind," Alaric snapped, stepping closer, his heavy boots echoing loudly. "Where is the proof a royal bloodline is not established by the mad ravings of a traitor on the block? The council will demand proof. I demand proof." Sterling let out a ragged, breathless laugh. He looked toward Eleanor. She stood a few paces away, half swallowed by the shadows, her crimson silk gown looking like a fresh wound in the darkness. She had not spoken a word since the balcony. "The Master of Shadows stripped me of my rings and my gold," Sterling whispered, his eyes locked on Eleanor. "But he did not check the heel of my left boot. Break it open." Alaric did not call for the guard. He drew the heavy hunting dagger from his belt, knelt, and violently wrenched Sterling's left boot from his foot. With a single brutal thrust, Alaric jammed the steel blade into the thick leather heel, twisting it until the wood and leather splintered apart. Hidden deep inside a hollowed-out cavity was a small, tightly bound pouch of blackened leather sealed with wax. Alaric pulled it free. He stood up, wiping the blade on his cloak before sheathing it. He broke the wax seal with his thumb and tipped the pouch into his large, scarred palm. A heavy gold object tumbled out, hitting his palm with a dull, significant thud. The king froze, his breath caught in his throat. It was a signet ring. But it was not just any ring. It was forged of solid, ancient gold, heavy and immaculate. Set into the center was a massive, flawless blood ruby, carved intricately with the crest of the crown prince, a blinding sunburst rising over a drawn sword. The sunburst signet. Alaric whispered the undeniable truth, crushing the air from his lungs. "Valerian's ring. The generals told me it was lost on the battlefield, plundered by scavengers." "He never took it to the battlefield," Sterling rasped from the floor. "He gave it to the seamstress on the night they spoke their secret vows. He told her it was the absolute proof of his devotion. When my sister stole the child from the bloody sheets, she took the ring from the dead mother's neck." Alaric slowly turned to face Eleanor. He extended his hand, palm open, the heavy gold ring resting in the center. Eleanor took a hesitant step forward. Her hands, which had not trembled when she faced banishment, which had not shaken when she confronted the treacherous nobility, were finally trembling now. She reached out. Her slender fingers brushed against Alaric's calloused palm as she picked up the ring. The metal was cold, but as her fingers closed around the blood ruby, a visceral, earth-shattering shift occurred within her chest. She looked down at the crest, the sunburst, the drawn sword. It was the crest of a king. In that single crystalline moment, the 20 years of her agonizing past rearranged themselves perfectly. The isolation in the Sterling estate, the way her uncle had always looked at her, not with mere disgust, but with a deep, hidden terror. The absolute refusal to let her learn the kingdom's history, the desperate attempts to keep her hidden from the capital. She had spent her entire life believing she was a burden, a worthless stray forced upon a noble house. She had not been hidden because she was worthless. She had been hidden because she was the most valuable, dangerous creature in the realm. The Phantom Queen was a lie. She was the dragon they had buried in the dark. A slow, devastating heat began to rise in her chest, melting away the ice she had worn as armor for decades. It was not sorrow. It was a pure, unadulterated, magnificent fury. Eleanor closed her fist around her father's ring. The sharp edges of the gold bit into her palm, grounding her, sharpening her focus until her mind was as clear as a diamond. She slowly lifted her head, her stormy gray eyes meeting Alaric's dark, shadowed gaze. The air between them changed instantly. The dynamic fractured and rebuilt itself in the span of a single breath. He was the king, the conqueror, the man who had worn the heavy steel crown and dragged the kingdom into submission. But as he looked at her standing in the torchlight, radiating a sudden terrifying majesty that required no title and no permission, Alaric realized the absolute truth.
He held the sword of Aethelgard, but the woman standing before him owned the kingdom. The heavy iron doors of the Chamber of Echoes groaned open, releasing King Alaric and Eleanor back into a palace that had fundamentally changed in the span of a single hour. They did not return to the drafty, isolated corridors of the East Wing. Without a word, Alaric escorted her up the grand, sweeping staircases toward the apex of the fortress, bypassing the whispering servants and the terrified, lingering nobles. He brought her to the king's personal suites, a sprawling, magnificent fortress within a fortress guarded by double rows of heavily armored sentries. The doors were made of solid oak and banded with steel. Once inside, the heavy doors clicked shut, severing them from the suffocating panic of the court. The chamber was bathed in the cold, clear light of the winter afternoon. Eleanor stood in the center of the vast room, the heavy wolf fur mantle slipping slightly from her shoulders. Her right hand was closed tightly, her knuckles white, guarding the heavy gold signet ring, as if releasing it would make the truth evaporate. Alaric stopped by the grand hearth. He did not look like a king who had just secured his palace. He looked like a general who had just realized his own fortress was built on a powder keg.
"The High Council is already convening," Alaric said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that broke the heavy silence. "They will demand blood. They will demand a narrative that buries what Sterling screamed in that courtyard."
Eleanor slowly turned her stormy gray eyes toward him. The phantom who had quietly managed his ledgers was gone. In her place stood a woman calculating the exact weight of her own survival. "And what narrative will you give them, Your Majesty?" she asked, her voice perfectly smooth, though it held an edge sharper than shattered glass. "Will you tell them I'm a madman's fiction? Will you annul the marriage now and cast me into the black cells to secure your borders?"
Alaric's jaw locked. He crossed the room in 3 long, predatory strides, stopping just inches from her. The sheer size of him, the scent of cold steel and winter wind, was entirely overwhelming, yet Eleanor did not step back. "If I wanted you in the black cells, you would not be standing in my private chambers," Alaric replied, his voice dropping into a fierce, intense whisper. He looked down at her clenched hand, then up to her eyes. "Do not leave these rooms. You are safe here. I'm placing my most loyal men at the door. Allow no one inside regardless of the seal they bear until I return." It was not the arrogant command of a tyrant. It was the desperate instruction of a protector. Eleanor held his gaze. She did not thank him. She simply nodded once. Alaric turned on his heel and marched out of the suites, the heavy oak doors slamming with a grim finality. Alone in the vast, gilded cage, Eleanor slowly opened her fist. The blood ruby of the sunburst signet caught the light from the high windows, flashing like a dark, beautiful wound. She was Valerius. The blood in her veins was the very foundation of the stone beneath her feet. She walked toward the massive windows overlooking the sprawling capital. She was no longer a cast-out bride surviving the shadows. She was the storm that was about to consume them all. 2 floors below the High Council chamber was vibrating with chaos. The room was a masterpiece of ancient power, dominated by a massive circular table carved from a single slab of obsidian. The 7 men seated around it were the true architects of Aethelgard's power, ancient lords who controlled the kingdom's wealth, its grain, and its vast armies. They were men who dealt in cold logic, and right now their logic dictated absolute panic. The heavy mahogany doors flew open, striking the stone walls with a violent crash. King Alaric strode into the room, his dark cape billowing behind him. The shouting died instantly. The counselors scrambled to their feet, bowing their heads, but the tension in the room was so thick it felt like trying to breathe underwater. Alaric did not sit in the high-backed chair at the head of the table. He paced slowly behind it, a wolf evaluating a pack of aging hounds. "I assume," Alaric began, his voice dangerously soft, "that the panic in this room is not merely due to a traitor raving on the execution block." Lord Malachor, the ancient and ruthless chancellor of the realm, stepped forward. His face was a map of deep wrinkles, his eyes cold and entirely unsympathetic. "A traitor raving is a nuisance, Your Majesty," Malachor stated smoothly. "But a traitor who screams a truth we spent 20 years burying is a catastrophe. If the girl is truly Valerian's daughter, the entire foundation of your reign is fractured." "My reign is forged in the blood I spilled for this kingdom," Alaric roared, slamming both hands down on the obsidian table. The heavy crystal wine goblets rattled violently. I held the borders when Valerian fell. I conquered the winter territories. My crown is not an ornament to be debated because of a ghost from the past. The small folk do not care about your conquests, Alaric, another counselor interjected, a man wearing the heavy furs of the eastern territories. They care about the divine right of kings. Prince Valerian was a god to them. If they learn his true-born daughter lives, they will see you as a usurper, a regent occupying a seat that belongs to her. And worse, Lord Malachor continued, his voice dropping to a lethal, practical whisper. Duke Caelan of the North. He has spent 10 years looking for a legal pretext to break away from the crown. If he hears that the true heir to the Iron Throne is alive and currently being treated as a disgraced, banished bride by the sitting king, he will not simply rebel. He will march on the capital under the banner of royal justice. He will claim he is coming to rescue the true queen. The silence in the chamber turned suffocating. Alaric's blood ran cold as the strategic nightmare unfolded before him. Malachor was right. The northern armies were massive. If Duke Caelan marched to save Eleanor, half the kingdom would flock to his banner out of blind loyalty to her dead father. There is only one mathematical solution to this equation, Your Majesty, Malachor said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. Alaric slowly lifted his head, his dark eyes fixing on the old chancellor. Speak it. The girl is a living weapon aimed directly at your throat, Malachor said flatly. She cannot be allowed to exist. The execution of Lord Stirling was a messy affair. We will draft a royal decree stating that Stirling's final words were a treasonous lie meant to sow discord. And tonight, while the palace sleeps, the false queen must succumb to a sudden tragic illness in her chambers. A quiet poison. By sunrise, the threat is eliminated and your throne is secure. The words hung in the air, heavy and poisoned. Succumb to a sudden illness. They wanted him to murder her. They wanted him to snuff out the magnificent, unyielding fire he had just discovered, simply to keep the political machine running smoothly. A roaring sound filled Alaric's ears. It was the sound of his own absolute fury. He felt the phantom weight of the steel crown on his head, a crown that suddenly felt like a shackle forged by old men hiding behind locked doors. Alaric drew the heavy hunting dagger from his belt in a lightning-fast motion. Before Malachor could even blink, the king slammed the blade down, burying it deep into the center of the obsidian table. The sharp crack of splintering stone echoed like a gunshot. The counselors violently flinched backward. "Let me be absolutely clear," Alaric growled, his voice vibrating with a terrifying primal violence. He leaned over the table, his face inches from Malachor's pale, trembling features. "The woman sitting in my chambers is the Queen of Valerius. She is my wife, and she carries the blood of my brother. If a single hair on her head falls, if her wine tastes strange, if the air in her room suddenly turns cold, I will not convene a tribunal. I will bar the doors to this chamber, and I will personally butcher every single one of you like livestock." Malachor swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the quivering dagger. "Your Majesty, you are choosing your own ruin. You cannot fight the entire realm for one woman." "I do not need to fight the realm," Alaric said, straightening up, pulling his velvet cloak around his broad shoulders. His eyes were entirely black, stripped of all mercy. "I own it. And if Duke Caelan wishes to test the strength of my walls, let him march. I will break his armies upon the Gates of Aethelgard." He turned and strode out of the council chamber, leaving the ancient lords in a terrified, stunned silence. But as King Alaric marched down the corridor, the adrenaline slowly faded, leaving behind a cold, creeping realization. He had drawn a line in the sand to protect her, but in doing so, he had just declared war against his own council, his own allies, and the entire northern half of his kingdom. The crown was slipping from his grasp, and the terrifying truth was he was entirely willing to let it fall, so long as it landed securely in Eleanor's hands. For 3 agonizing days, the king's private suites became a gilded tomb. Outside the heavy steel-banded doors, the palace of Aethelgard was tearing itself apart. Eleanor could not see the chaos, but she could feel the violent vibrations of a kingdom fracturing. The muffled rhythmic marching of heavy infantry echoed constantly through the stone floors.
The sharp blasts of brass war horns pierced the winter air at erratic intervals, signaling emergency deployments. Inside, however, the silence was suffocating. Eleanor stood by the grand window, her forehead resting against the freezing glass. She wore a simple gown of dark charcoal wool, stripped of the heavy silks of the court. Hidden beneath the high collar of her dress, resting heavy and cold against her collarbone, was the sunburst signet. She had strung her father's ring onto a silver chain, a physical anchor to the devastating truth of her existence. She was a queen trapped in a tower, guarded by 4 massive sentries, who answered only to Alaric. He had promised to protect her, but protection, she was quickly learning, felt exactly like imprisonment. The heavy oak doors clicked open. Eleanor did not turn around. She expected a servant bearing another tray of untouched food, but the footsteps were too deliberate, too measured. It was Madame Vane. The head housekeeper slipped into the room, her severe face tight with a terror Eleanor had never seen the old woman display. In her hands, she did not carry a silver tray, but a crumpled piece of dark parchment. "My lady," Madame Vane whispered, bowing her head quickly. She moved to the window, avoiding the sightline of the guards in the corridor. "The palace is sealed. The king has locked down the gates, but secrets are like water in this fortress. They always find the cracks." Eleanor turned her stormy gray eyes, locking onto the parchment. "What has happened?" Madame Vane handed her the letter. "The High Council. When the king threatened them, they knew they could not strike you directly, so they whispered. They sent ravens into the dark. The truth of the execution courtyard reached the northern territories 2 days ago." Eleanor unfolded the parchment. Her eyes scanned the hurried, frantic script from one of Madame Vane's informants. The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. Duke Calin of the North has mobilized the winter vanguard. 50,000 men march toward the capital. They do not fly the wolf banner alone. They fly the sunburst. The Duke has declared King Alaric a usurper. He marches under the holy vow to liberate the true heir from her captor and place the rightful queen upon the Iron Throne. The parchment slipped from Eleanor's fingers, drifting to the thick Persian rug like a dead leaf. "They are marching for you, Your Majesty," Madame Vane whispered, a desperate, confused hope in her voice. "They are coming to save you." Eleanor stared at the fallen letter. A sudden violent chill seized her, radiating from her chest down to her fingertips. The air in the room suddenly felt entirely toxic. "Save her." The words echoed in her mind, twisting into something grotesque and horrifying. She closed her eyes, the heavy gold ring burning against her skin. For 20 years, Lord Stirling had kept her locked in the dark, treating her as a shameful secret to protect his own political survival. He had thrown her to a furious king at the altar to test the crown's weakness. She had been a pawn, moved across the board without consent, stripped of her voice, her name, and her dignity. And now Duke Calin, a ruthless warlord who had hated her father, was raising an army in her name. He did not care about the orphaned daughter of Valerian. He did not care about her suffering or her right to rule. He only cared that her bloodline was the perfect legal weapon to shatter Alaric's reign and claim the capital for himself. "They are not marching for me, Madame Vane," Eleanor said. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it vibrated with a profound, earth-shattering agony. "They are marching for a banner. They are marching for a ghost." The cruel injustice of her reality crashed down upon her. She had survived the humiliation of the wedding. She had survived the mockery of the court. She had even survived the terrifying realization of her true royal blood. But this was a violation she could not endure. They were using her, again. She had traded the dark, drafty halls of the Stirling estate for the king's magnificent suites, but she was still just an object, a prize to be won, an excuse for men to draw their swords and bleed the kingdom dry. "I am the excuse for a civil war," Eleanor breathed, her hands balling into fists at her sides. The corset around her ribs felt like iron bands squeezing the breath from her lungs. "Thousands will die, and they will paint my name on their shields while they do it. I will not be the blade they use to cut Aethelgard in half." Down in the subterranean depths of the palace, the royal war room was a portrait of controlled hysteria. King Alaric stood over the massive map table. His armor was scarred and battle-worn, his heavy velvet cloak cast aside. The map of Aethelgard was covered in carved wooden markers. A massive cluster of black wolves was aggressively pushing south, moving with terrifying speed toward the capital. Commander Silas stood across the table, his face grim. Beside him, Lord Kalen, the Master of Shadows, hovered in the dim light. "Duke Kalen's vanguard crossed the frozen river at dawn, sire," Silas reported, pointing a heavily gauntleted finger at the map. "He has bypassed the border forts entirely. He is making a direct line for the capital. He will reach the gates in 4 days. He leaves his supply lines exposed." Alaric growled, his dark eyes analyzing the board with lethal precision. "He is moving fast because he relies on momentum. He hopes the small folk in the city guards will open the gates for him when they see the sunburst banner. And they might." "Your Majesty," the Master of Shadows rasped softly. "The council's whispers were effective. The streets are boiling. The people believe you have locked the true queen in a tower, holding her hostage to maintain your grip on the crown." Alaric slammed his fist onto the edge of the oak table. The wood splintered. He was trapped in a nightmare of his own making. If he marched out to crush the Duke's army, he would be slaughtering his own citizens, confirming the narrative that he was a tyrant clinging to a stolen throne. If he stayed behind the walls, it was only a matter of time before the city tore itself apart from the inside. And at the center of it all was Eleanor, the woman he had sworn to protect, the woman whose very existence was unraveling his empire. "Deploy the heavy cavalry to the northern ridge," Alaric commanded, his voice cold, devoid of the panic that consumed his generals. "Fortify the main gates. No one enters or leaves the capital." "And the Queen, sire?" Silas asked hesitantly. "The High Council has requested an audience. They suggest removing her from the capital entirely, under heavy guard to a remote monastery, for her own safety until the war is won." Alaric's head snapped up. His eyes burned with a dark, murderous warning. "The council wants her on a lonely road where she can be quietly ambushed and buried in an unmarked grave. Tell the council that if they mention her relocation again, I will mount their heads on the battlements before the Duke arrives." Silas bowed deeply, stepping back. Alaric looked back down at the map. The black wooden markers of the rebel army were closing in. He had to prepare his men for a slaughter. He had to defend the crown he wore. But as he stared at the map, he realized he could not leave for the front lines without looking her in the eyes. The king turned and marched out of the war room, heading up the grand staircases toward his suites. He expected to find her waiting in the quiet sanctuary he had provided. He expected to find her seeking his protection from the storm gathering outside. He was wrong. When Alaric reached the top of the stairs, he found his 4 heavily armored sentries stepping backward, their halberds lowered defensively, looking entirely unsure of how to proceed. Standing in the open doorway of the king's suites was Eleanor. She had not wept. She had not hidden. She stood perfectly straight, the silver chain around her neck, pulled out from beneath her dress, the heavy sunburst signet resting openly against the dark wool for all to see. The icy, terrifying majesty of Valerius radiated from her every breath. "Stand aside," Eleanor commanded the guards, her voice ringing with the flawless, undeniable authority of a monarch who was absolutely done being a prisoner. Alaric stopped at the end of the corridor, his heart violently slamming against his ribs. The Phantom Queen was dead. The dragon had woken up. The 4 sentries in the corridor stood frozen, their halberds wavering. They were trained to hold the line against charging cavalry, but they had no defense against the absolute icy authority radiating from the woman standing before them. The heavy gold of the sunburst signet resting against her dark gown felt like a physical weight pressing the air from the hall. Before the captain of the guard could stutter an apology, King Alaric's heavy boots struck the marble floor. "Lower your weapons," Alaric commanded. His voice was not a shout, but the dark, resonant timbre of it immediately forced the guards to snap to attention, the steel points of their halberds hitting the stone floor in unison. Alaric closed the distance between them. He did not look at the sentries. His dark, predatory gaze was locked entirely on Eleanor. He saw the storm raging in her gray eyes, the rigid, unbreakable line of her spine. She was not fleeing. She was marching to war. "You are exposing yourself," Alaric said, his tone low and dangerous. "The council has eyes in every shadow of this palace. And you have locked me in a gilded vault while the kingdom burns in my name," Eleanor replied, her voice flawlessly steady, though it carried the sharp edge of a drawn blade.
I will not be hidden, Alaric. I have played the ghost for 20 years. I am done. Alaric's jaw tightened. He did not argue with her in the open corridor. Instead, he reached out his large, gauntleted hand, wrapping firmly but gently around her elbow. He guided her past the stunned sentries, leading her away from the royal suites and down the winding torchlit stone stairs into the subterranean depths of the fortress. He brought her to the war room, the heavy oak doors shut behind them, sealing them in the cavernous, dimly lit chamber. The air smelled of melting beeswax, old parchment, and the cold iron of weapons. In the center of the room sat the massive oak map table covered in the sprawling parchment of Aethelgard. Eleanor pulled her arm from his grip, stepping forward to look at the table. Her eyes immediately caught the terrifying cluster of black wooden markers, carving a path straight from the northern territories toward the capital. 50,000 men, Alaric said, stepping up beside her, his presence a towering wall of dark velvet and steel. Duke Cailan is marching on the capital. He carries the sunburst banner. He has told the realm that he comes to liberate the true queen from the tyrant who stole her throne. Eleanor stared at the wooden markers. Her chest tightened violently, the corset restricting her breath as a wave of profound, sickening injustice washed over her. "He does not care about the true queen," Eleanor said, her voice dropping into a bitter, resonant whisper. "He hated my father. He is using my bloodline as a key to unlock the gates of your city. I am nothing but a banner to him, a legal excuse for slaughter." "Which is exactly why you must remain in the royal suites," Alaric countered, his voice rising thick with the unyielding command of a warlord. "The council wants you dead to erase the threat. The Duke wants you as a puppet to legitimize his treason. If you step outside the protection of my guards, you will be torn apart by men who want to use your blood to paint their shields." Eleanor spun around to face him. The sheer force of her fury was magnificent. She did not shrink back from the king. She stepped into his space, her stormy gray eyes blazing with a fire that could melt stone. "Do not speak to me of being used." Eleanor fired back, the pristine, aristocratic melody of her voice finally cracking under the weight of her agony. "My uncle used me to test your pride. You used me to prove your absolute authority before the court. And now you lock me in a tower to protect the legitimacy of your own reign. You call it protection, Alaric, but it is just another cage. I will not be the excuse for a civil war. I will not let thousands of men die in my name, simply because you are too proud to admit that the crown on your head belongs to me." The silence that slammed into the war room was absolute. The accusation echoed off the dark stone walls, heavy and unforgiving. Alaric did not erupt. The furious conqueror suddenly went entirely terrifyingly still. He looked at her. He saw the violent heave of her chest, the pale, flawless skin of her throat, and the heavy gold ring resting against her collarbone, the undeniable proof that she was the master of his house. Slowly, deliberately, Alaric took a step forward. Eleanor held her ground. He took another step, closing the distance until the heavy steel of his armor brushed against the dark wool of her gown. He backed her up, forcing her to take a half step in retreat until her lower back hit the edge of the massive oak map table. She was trapped between the sprawling map of the kingdom and the towering, suffocating presence of its king. Alaric reached out. He did not grab her arms. He lifted his large, scarred hand, his knuckles brushing against the sensitive skin of her throat as his fingers curled around the heavy silver chain holding the sunburst signet. He lifted the heavy gold ring, feeling the weight of the ruby in his palm. "You think I care about the crown?" Alaric whispered. His voice was a dark, vibrating hum that sent a shockwave of heat straight down her spine. "You think I lock you in my suites to protect a piece of steel on my head?" Eleanor's breath hitched. She looked up into his eyes, expecting to see the arrogant fury of a tyrant. Instead, she saw a raw, devastating vulnerability that stripped the warlord bare. Alaric leaned in closer, his face mere inches from hers. The scent of winter frost and male aggression was entirely intoxicating. "I conquered this kingdom because it was breaking," Alaric murmured, his eyes dropping to her lips before snapping back to her stormy gaze. "I wore the crown because there was no one else strong enough to carry it. But you—" He let the heavy gold ring fall back against her chest. "You carry the weight of an empire in your spine, Eleanor.
You possess a majesty I could never forge with a sword." He placed both of his heavy hands flat on the oak table, one on either side of her hips, caging her in completely. The air between them pulled so tight it sparked. "I am not fighting Duke Cailan to keep my throne," Alaric stated, his voice dropping to a fierce, guttural vow. "I am fighting him, because he dares to lay claim to what is mine. But I will not keep you as a prisoner, Eleanor. I am done treating you like a pawn." He stepped back just enough to give her breath, though his dark eyes never released her. "The board is yours." Alaric declared the words heavy with the ultimate surrender of his absolute ego. "The true heir is revealed, so tell me, Eleanor Valerius, tell me right now, do you want to rule this kingdom with me, or do you want to destroy me and take it for yourself? Give the command, and I will tear the crown from my own head and place it at your feet." Eleanor stared at the towering king of Aethelgard. Her heart pounded a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs. He was not testing her. He was offering her the entire kingdom, his life, and his absolute submission right there in the shadows of the war room. The Phantom Queen had vanished. The dragon had awakened. And the warlord who had conquered the north had just willingly handed her his sword. Eleanor lifted her chin. The fury in her eyes melted into something infinitely more dangerous, cold, calculating royal power. "I do not want your crown at my feet, Alaric," she said softly, her voice regaining its flawless, regal composure. "I want it on your head, because when I shatter the High Council and break the Northern Army, I will need my king, standing beside me to witness it." King Alaric rode out at dawn. The departure of the royal army was not a grand, celebrated affair. There were no flowers thrown from the balconies, no cheering crowds. It was a grim, thunderous march of 10,000 heavy cavalry and seasoned infantry, moving out to intercept Duke Cailan's vanguard before the rebels could reach the vulnerable farmlands of the inner valley. From the high window of the king's suites, Eleanor watched Alaric's dark, armored figure disappear into the winter fog. He had left Commander Silas and a detachment of his most lethal, fiercely loyal guards to hold the royal corridors, leaving explicit orders that no one was to enter the queen's chambers. But a fortress stripped of its warlord is a fortress that belongs to the politicians. As night fell, the sprawling palace of Aethelgard changed. The aggressive, ringing energy of the soldiers was replaced by the suffocating, silent tension of the court. The air grew heavy. The shadows in the corners of the grand drawing room seemed to stretch further across the Persian rugs. Eleanor sat by the roaring hearth, reading a thick, leather-bound volume on the kingdom's ancient laws of succession. She was preparing for a war of parchment and ink, knowing Alaric was fighting the war of steel and blood. A sharp, violent commotion echoed from the corridor outside her doors. Eleanor closed the book, her spine straightening instantly. The heavy oak doors muffled the shouting, but she could hear Silas's furious bark of command, followed by the terrifying synchronized sound of 30 halberds hitting the stone floor. The heavy doors groaned open. Silas stood in the threshold, his face pale with suppressed rage, his hand gripping the hilt of his broadsword. "Forgive me, your majesty." Silas forced the words through gritted teeth. "I attempted to bar their path, but they invoked the law of the empty throne. While the king is at war, the High Council has the legal authority to bypass the royal guard to secure the succession." Behind Silas, stepping out from the shadows of the corridor, were the 7 ancient lords of the High Council. Lord Malachor, the Chancellor of the realm, led them into the room. He wore heavy robes of midnight blue velvet, trimmed with silver, looking every inch the benevolent grandfather, though his eyes were as dead and cold as a serpent's. The other 6 counselors filed in, silently fanning out across the drawing room, effectively surrounding her. "You may leave us, Commander Silas," Malachor said smoothly, not even looking at the furious guard. "This is a matter of state protocol. The Queen requires our counsel." Silas looked at Eleanor, his eyes silently begging her to give him the command to slaughter the old men where they stood. But Eleanor knew that if Silas drew first blood against the High Council, the entire palace guard would fracture, and a civil war would ignite inside the castle walls before Alaric even reached the front lines. "Wait outside, Silas," Eleanor said, her voice perfectly calm, giving away none of the ice spreading through her veins. "The council and I will not be long." Silas hesitated, then bowed stiffly and stepped back, shutting the heavy doors behind him. The loud *click* of the lock sounded like a vault ceiling shut. Eleanor remained seated in her high-backed chair. She did not stand to greet them. She rested her hands gracefully in her lap, her stormy gray eyes scanning the 7 most powerful men in Aethelgard. "To what do I owe this intrusion, Lord Malachor?" Eleanor asked, her tone conversational, yet dripping with aristocratic frost. Malachor stepped forward, carrying a small silver tray. Upon it sat a single crystal goblet, filled with deep, ruby-red wine, and a tiny glass vial, entirely empty of its contents. He placed the tray gently onto the low mahogany table between them. The scent of the wine was rich, but beneath it lay a faint, bitter aroma of crushed bitterroot and nightshade. "We come to you not as your enemies. Your Majesty," Malachor said, his voice laced with a sickening, manufactured sorrow, "but as the humble servants of the realm, a realm that is currently tearing itself apart in your name." Eleanor looked at the poisoned wine. Her heart slammed against her ribs, but her face remained an impenetrable mask of marble. "Duke Cailan marches with 50,000 men," Malachor continued, folding his hands before him. "The king rides to meet him with a fraction of that number. Thousands of young men will be butchered in the snow. The kingdom will bleed for a decade, and whoever wins will rule over a graveyard." "And your solution is in that goblet," Eleanor stated. It was not a question. "It is a painless draught," Malachor whispered. "A deep, dreamless sleep. If you pass from this world tonight, a tragic victim of a sudden winter fever, Duke Cailan's holy war instantly loses its banner. He will have no true heir to rescue. His generals will abandon him when they realize the prize is gone. The king's throne will be secure. You have the power to save Aethelgard, Eleanor. You need only make the sacrifice." The sheer terrifying audacity of the logic hung heavily in the warm air of the room. They had dressed murder in the elegant robes of patriotism. They wanted her to kill herself so they could maintain their comfortable grip on the treasury without the inconvenience of a northern invasion. The other 6 counselors watched her, waiting for the tears, the desperate pleading, the inevitable breakdown of a young woman crushed by the impossible weight of the kingdom. Eleanor did not weep. She leaned forward slowly, the heavy gold of the sunburst signet catching the firelight as it slipped from beneath the collar of her dress. She reached out and picked up the crystal goblet. Malachor's eyes gleamed with a dark, triumphant satisfaction. "You speak so beautifully of sacrifice, Chancellor," Eleanor murmured, swirling the poisoned wine. The deep red liquid coated the glass like blood. "You speak of saving the kingdom from ruin. But tell me, Lord Malachor, did you think of the kingdom's ruin when you skimmed 40,000 gold pieces from the eastern grain tariffs last winter?" Malachor's triumphant smile vanished instantly. His face went entirely rigid. Eleanor did not stop. She turned her piercing, stormy gaze to the counselor standing by the window. "And you, Lord Vance, did you think of the small folk when you quietly diverted the crown's iron shipments to your own private armories in the south?" The counselors shifted nervously, exchanging panicked, horrified glances. "For 20 years I was forced to live in the shadows," Eleanor said, her voice dropping into a melodic, terrifyingly calm register. She stood up, holding the goblet of poison. "And for the past month, while you old men drank the king's wine and plotted behind locked doors, I have been reading the ledgers of this palace. I know exactly how deeply you have rotted the foundation of this kingdom. You speak treason," Malachor stammered, stepping back, his polished composure shattering under the weight of her absolute certainty. "I speak the truth," Eleanor countered, taking a slow step toward him. "And here is the ultimate truth of your pathetic mathematical equation. If I drink this wine and die tonight, Duke Cailan will not turn his army around. He will use my murder as the ultimate proof of the crown's corruption. He will march through those gates, and to legitimize his takeover, he will require scapegoats." She stopped right in front of Malachor, her eyes burning with the majestic, unyielding fire of the true Valerius bloodline. "Duke Cailan will not execute the king," Eleanor whispered, her voice a lethal vibrating blade. "He will execute the High Council. He will hang all 7 of you from the highest towers of Aethelgard, to prove to the small folk that he has cleansed the corruption that killed their true queen." Malachor turned the color of ash. The remaining counselors were suddenly sweating profusely, the horrific realization dawning on them. She was entirely, flawlessly correct. They had built a trap for her, and she had just calmly pointed out that they were standing directly on the trigger. Eleanor placed the poisoned goblet back onto the silver tray with a sharp, echoing asterisk clink asterisk. "I am Eleanor Valerius," she declared, her voice ringing with the undeniable authority of the throne. "I am the true heir to the Iron Crown, and I do not die in the dark to protect cowards." She turned toward the heavy oak doors. "Silas!" Eleanor commanded. The sheer force of her voice pierced the thick wood. The doors instantly flew open. Commander Silas and a dozen heavily armed royal guards flooded into the room, their weapons drawn, entirely ready to spill blood. "The High Council has requested my protection from the coming siege," Eleanor announced loudly, her gaze sweeping over the terrified old men. "They are not to leave these suites. They will remain here under heavy armed guard until the king returns. If any of them attempt to leave, or if they suddenly succumb to a tragic, dreamless sleep, you have my permission to treat them as traitors to the crown." Malakor's mouth opened, but no words came out. The 7 most powerful men in the kingdom had just been elegantly, ruthlessly placed under house arrest by the woman they had come to murder. Eleanor swept past them, the heavy fabric of her dark gown hissing against the stone floor. She walked out of the drawing room and into the grand corridors of her palace, leaving the vipers trapped in their own cage. The morning arrived not with sunlight, but with the suffocating scent of burning wood and the distant terrifying tolling of the city bells. Duke Kaelin's vanguard had moved faster than anyone anticipated. From the high windows of the royal suites, Eleanor could see the dark, bruising clouds of smoke rising from the outer valley. The northern army was burning the winter fields as they marched, sending a clear, violent message to the capital: yield or starve. The streets of Aethelgard, usually bustling with merchants and citizens, were paralyzed by panic. Small folk were boarding up their doors, and the frantic shouting of the city watch echoed faintly over the high walls. Inside the palace, the absence of King Alaric and the sudden unexplained disappearance of the High Council had left the remaining forces leaderless. The fortress was bleeding order by the second. Eleanor turned away from the window. The time for waiting in the shadows was over. Madame Vane stood silently by the massive oak wardrobe, her severe face deeply etched with worry. In her wrinkled hands, she held a heavy iron key that had not been turned in over 2 decades. "The king commanded you to stay in these rooms, Your Majesty," Madame Vane whispered, her voice trembling slightly against the heavy silence of the chamber. "The king commanded me to stay safe," Eleanor corrected, her voice flawlessly steady, stripping away the last remnants of the phantom queen. "But a queen who hides while her city burns is no queen at all. Open the vault, Madame Vane." The old housekeeper nodded slowly. She moved to a concealed door behind the heavy tapestries, inserting the iron key into a rusted lock. It turned with a harsh, groaning click. The small windowless vault smelled of cedar and dried lavender. From the dark interior, Madame Vane pulled out a massive, leather-bound trunk bearing the faded golden crest of the sunburst. It was the wardrobe of the crown princess, the matriarchs of Valerian's true line, locked away and forgotten when the High Council tried to erase his legacy. Eleanor stripped off the plain dark wool of her exile. She did not wear the silver and blue of Alaric's house. Today she required armor forged of history. With Madame Vane's careful assistance, Eleanor dressed. The gown was a masterpiece of ancient royal authority, fashioned from heavy midnight black velvet that seemed to absorb the light. The high collar and structured bodice were intensely embroidered with threads of pure gold, forming the intricate, blinding pattern of the sunburst. The corset was laced ruthlessly tight, forcing her spine into an unbreakable, majestic line. Finally, Eleanor took the heavy gold signet ring of her father and secured it not on a hidden chain, but openly upon her right index finger. She looked at herself in the tall standing mirror. The forgotten niece of House Sterling was completely gone. The banished bride had been eradicated. Staring back at her was Eleanor Valerius, the absolute, undeniable heir to the Iron Throne, terrifying and magnificent in her dark gold armor. "Assemble the remaining guards," Eleanor commanded, her voice ringing with a cold, clear authority that made Madame Vane instinctively drop into a deep curtsy. "We are going to the Great Hall." The descent of the true queen through the palace of Aethelgard was a seismic event. As Eleanor walked the grand corridors, her heavy velvet skirts whispering against the marble. The palace seemed to hold its breath. The servants who had once mocked her, the guards who had once ignored her, all froze in their tracks. They saw the golden sunburst burning against the black velvet. They felt the overwhelming, icy pressure of her presence. Without a single word being spoken, men and women dropped to their knees, bowing their heads to the cold stone as she passed. She did not acknowledge them. She kept her stormy gray eyes fixed dead ahead. In the great hall, chaos reigned. General Varus, the man left in charge of the city garrison, was standing over a tactical map, shouting furiously at 3 other battalion commanders. The massive room was filled with the frantic noise of clashing armor and terrified debate.
"We cannot hold the outer gates," Varus roared, slamming his gauntleted fist onto the table. "The Duke has 50,000 men. The king is engaged in the valley, and the High Council is nowhere to be found. If we do not open the gates and parley, Cailan will breach the walls by nightfall and slaughter every citizen in the lower rings." "You suggest we surrender the capital without drawing a sword," another commander shouted back. "That is treason." "It is survival."
Varus fired back, his face red with panic.
"The Duke claims he marches for the true heir. If we yield the gates, he has no reason to burn the city."
"He will not burn the city, General Varus, because the city is mine." The melodic, terrifyingly calm voice sliced through the shouting like a tempered steel blade. The generals spun around their hands, instinctively dropping to the hilts of their swords. But as they saw who was standing at the entrance of the great hall, the blood drained entirely from their faces. Eleanor walked slowly into the cavernous room, flanked by Commander Silas and a dozen heavily armed royal guards. The stained glass windows cast fractured pools of light across her black and gold gown, illuminating the sunburst crest upon her chest. She did not stop at the edge of the room. She walked directly toward the tactical map, forcing the hardened military commanders to step back, yielding their space simply through the sheer, crushing weight of her aristocratic presence. General Varus swallowed hard, trying to maintain his military bearing. "My lady, you should not be here. The palace is not secure. The High Council is currently under heavily armed house arrest in my private suites for attempting to poison me." Eleanor stated, her voice perfectly flat, loud enough for every soldier in the hall to hear. A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the commanders. Eleanor rested her right hand on the edge of the tactical map. The heavy gold of the sunburst signet clinked sharply against the wood, flashing in the winter light. Varus stared at the ring. His eyes widened in absolute shock as the reality of the rumors finally materialized in front of him. "I am Eleanor Valerius," she declared, her voice resonating off the vaulted ceilings, echoing with centuries of sovereign right. "Daughter of Crown Prince Valerian, the rightful blood-sworn heir to the crown you are sworn to protect." She looked directly into Varus's eyes, her stormy gaze pinning the veteran general to the floor. "You speak of yielding my gates to a traitor who uses my father's name as an excuse for slaughter," Eleanor continued, her tone dropping to a lethal vibrating register. "Duke Cailan does not march for me. He marches for a throne that does not belong to him, and I will not allow you to hand him my city simply because you are afraid of his numbers." "Your Majesty," Varus stammered, his military pride crumbling under her flawless authority. "The men are terrified. They do not know who commands them. Without the king, without the council, the garrison is breaking." "The garrison will not break," Eleanor commanded, her spine straight as a sword. "Because I command them, I am instituting absolute martial law within the walls of Aethelgard. You will fortify the outer gates. You will arm the city watch. You will position archers on every battlement. If Duke Cailan wishes to take my city, he will have to bleed for every single stone." She stepped away from the table, looking out over the stunned military commanders. "The king is fighting for this realm in the snow," Eleanor said, the ice in her voice shifting into a fierce, blinding fire. "We will hold this fortress until he returns. Anyone who speaks of surrender, anyone who attempts to lower the gates will be executed by my direct order. Do I make myself entirely clear, General Troy?" Varus looked at the woman standing before him. He saw the dark velvet, the golden sun, and the terrifying, magnificent strength that no army could ever manufacture. He did not see a banished bride. He saw the true monarch of Aethelgard. General Varus drew his broadsword,
held the blade flat against his chest, and sank heavily to one knee. "It is clear, my queen," Varys said, his voice thick with a sudden, fierce loyalty. A heartbeat later, the other commanders drew their weapons and fell to their knees. The echoing clatter of steel and armor filled the great hall as the entire military command of the capital bowed to the true bloodline. Eleanor stood above them, the heavy gold ring cold against her finger. The city was hers. Now she just had to defend it. The earth around Aethelgard did not just shake, it shuddered under the rhythm of treason. 50,000 men of the winter vanguard marched upon the capital, an endless, terrifying ocean of dark, steel-heavy firs and bristling pikes. The winter wind whipped through the valley, carrying the bitter scent of ash from the burned farmlands and the metallic tang of unsheathed weapons. Above the massive sea of soldiers, hundreds of banners snapped violently in the gale. They were not the wolf banners of the north. They were the golden sunbursts of Prince Valerian's stolen symbols, meant to disguise an invasion as a holy crusade. Inside the black obsidian walls of the fortress, the city watch and the royal garrison stood upon the high battlements, their bows drawn, their hands trembling against the freezing stone. At the massive iron gates, Duke Cailan rode forward. He sat atop a massive armored warhorse flanked by his elite cavalry. He wore an immaculate coat of white wolf fur over polished silver plate, looking entirely confident. He expected a panicked garrison. He expected the gates to groan open under the weight of his psychological warfare. "Soldiers of Aethelgard," Duke Cailan's voice boomed, amplified by the natural acoustics of the valley and the deafening silence of his waiting army. "I do not come as your conqueror. I come as the sword of royal justice. Your king is a usurper who has locked the true heir in the dark. Open these gates. Surrender the capital, and I swear upon the old gods that no citizen shall bleed today. We march only to place Eleanor Valerius upon her rightful throne." A murmur rippled through the soldiers on the battlements. The psychological poison was working. The men holding the walls revered Valerian's memory, and the thought of firing arrows at an army fighting for his daughter was tearing their discipline apart. General Varys stood on the parapet, his jaw clenched, preparing to shout a defiant refusal, knowing it would likely trigger the slaughter. But before Varys could draw a breath, the heavy rhythmic tread of boots echoed up the stone stairs of the battlements. The soldiers turned, and then they parted. They did not step aside out of military protocol. They fell back out of pure, instinctive reverence. Eleanor emerged onto the high wall. The freezing winter wind immediately tore at her, but she did not shiver. The iron boning of her corset pressed fiercely against her ribs as she drew a breath of freezing air, her spine remaining as unyielding as the iron portcullis below. She wore the midnight black velvet of the ancient queens, the massive gold sunburst embroidered across her chest, catching the weak winter light like a beacon. Flanked by Commander Silas and a phalanx of royal guards, she walked to the very edge of the parapet, completely exposing herself to the army below. She did not hide behind the stone crenellations. She stood in the open, looking down at the ocean of steel. Down in the valley, the murmurs of 50,000 men suddenly died. The sheer shocking visual of the woman on the wall sent a ripple of profound hesitation through the vanguard. They had been told she was a captive, a frail, weeping prisoner locked in a tower. But the woman looking down at them possessed a terrifying, immaculate majesty that made their stolen banners look like cheap imitations. Duke Cailan's horse shifted uneasily. The Duke stared up at the battlements, his arrogant smile faltering for a fraction of a second. Eleanor placed her hands flat on the freezing stone ledge. She looked directly at the rebel warlord, her stormy gray eyes piercing the distance. "You speak my name very loudly for a man who hopes I am dead, Cailan." Eleanor's voice rang out. She did not scream. She spoke with a perfectly controlled, resonant projection, the voice of a monarch who expected the world to fall silent when she opened her mouth. The wind seemed to carry her words over the vanguard, crisp and lethal. Duke Cailan recovered his composure, raising his voice to ensure his men could hear his righteous indignation. "My queen, we have come to liberate you. Your captor has fled the city, leaving you to burn. Order these men to open the gates and take your rightful place among your loyal subjects." Eleanor's expression did not change. She did not display gratitude, nor did she display fear.
She projected absolute devastating clarity. "My captor," Eleanor repeated the words, dripping with cold, aristocratic mockery. "King Alaric did not flee this city, Duke Cailan. He rode out with 10,000 men to break your supply lines, while you foolishly marched your vanguard into a siege you cannot win. He fights for my kingdom in the snow, while you stand at my gates demanding I hand it to you." A murmur of confusion swept through the front ranks of the Northern Army. The narrative was cracking. "You march under my father's banner," Eleanor continued, her voice slicing through the winter air, sharp and unyielding. "You tell these men that you fight for the true heir. You claim you want to place me on the Iron Throne." She raised her right hand high above her head, the heavy gold of the sunburst signet. The undeniable ancient proof of her bloodline flashed brilliantly against the dark sky. Every soldier in the valley, every archer on the wall saw the legendary ring of the crown prince. "I am Eleanor Valerius," she declared, her voice echoing like thunder across the valley. "I am the blood of the Iron Crown, and I am telling you right now that I am already on my throne. I command this fortress. I command this garrison. The High Council who plotted against me is currently rotting in my dungeons by my explicit order." Duke Cailan's face drained of color. He opened his mouth to shout to rally his men, but Eleanor did not give him the space to breathe. She leaned forward over the parapet, her eyes burning with the magnificent, terrifying fire of a dragon defending its hoard. "So let us test this loyalty you speak of, Duke Cailan," Eleanor challenged, her voice vibrating with lethal authority. She swept her gaze over the 50,000 men below. "If you march for the true queen, your queen is standing before you. If you revere the sunburst, the true heir is speaking to you. I order you to drop your weapons. I order you to turn your horses around. I order you to kneel before the walls of Aethelgard." The silence that followed was apocalyptic. It was the absolute crushing weight of a psychological checkmate. Eleanor had stripped away Cailan's entire political facade. She had forced the Northern Army to look at the undeniable truth. If they attacked the walls now, they were not liberators. They were traitors actively trying to murder the very woman they claimed to worship. Duke Cailan drew his sword, his face twisting in frantic rage. "It is a trick. The king forces her to speak. Break the gates." But the army did not surge forward. The front ranks of the vanguard men, who had grown up on the legends of Prince Valerian, looked up at the woman in the black and gold velvet. They saw the stormy gray eyes of the beloved prince. They saw the heavy gold ring. They saw a queen who stood in the freezing wind without trembling, demanding their obedience, not with a sword, but with the absolute terrifying right of her blood. A heavy, agonizing moment passed. The winter wind howled. Then a single sound echoed near the front of the northern lines. It was the sharp asterisk clatter asterisk of a steel pike being dropped onto the frozen earth. A seasoned captain of the northern infantry took a step forward, looked up at the battlements, and slowly, deliberately dropped to one knee.
"No!"
Cailan roared, slashing his sword through the air.
"Stand up, you fools!"
But the dam had broken. Another soldier dropped his weapon, then 10, then 50. The clattering of steel against the frozen ground spread through the vanguard like a massive, unstoppable wave. Entire battalions of the Northern Army sank to the earth, bowing their heads to the figure on the wall, refusing to draw blood against the true heir. Duke Cailan sat on his war horse, surrounded by an ocean of kneeling men, utterly isolated. His rebellion shattered not by an army, but by the spine of a single woman standing on a wall. Eleanor looked down at the defeated warlord. She did not smile. She simply lowered her hand, the heavy gold ring resting against her dark velvet gown. The siege was broken. The crown was secure. King Alaric rode back into the valley of Aethelgard with 10,000 heavy cavalry at his back, fully expecting to drown in a sea of blood. He had spent the last 2 days ruthlessly dismantling Duke Cailan's supply lines in the winter forests, cutting off the rebel army's lifeline. He had pushed his men and his warhorse to the absolute brink of exhaustion, to return to the capital, his mind haunted by the terrifying vision of the black obsidian walls, breached and the palace in flames. But as the royal cavalry crested the final ridge overlooking the valley, the king abruptly pulled back on his reins. His massive black destrier reared slightly, its hooves striking the frozen earth, as Alaric stared down at the impossible scene below. There was no smoke. There were no siege ladders against the walls. The 50,000 men of the winter vanguard were encamped in absolute eerie silence across the frozen plains. Their weapons were piled into massive mounds of discarded steel. The stolen golden sunburst banners had been lowered, and at the center of the camp, heavily guarded by the city watch of Aethelgard Duke Kaelin, sat in iron chains, stripped of his white wolf furs. Alaric's hardened generals rode up beside him, their faces masks of utter bewilderment. They had prepared for a slaughter, and instead they had arrived at a surrender. Alaric looked up at the high battlements of his fortress. A profound, earth-shattering realization settled into his bones. He knew exactly whose spine had broken the Northern Rebellion. He spurred his horse forward, thundering down into the valley toward the open, unscarred gates of his city. The palace of Aethelgard was vibrating with a new, terrifying energy. When the king marched through the grand corridors, his heavy armor covered in snow and the dirt of the road, the servants and guards did not merely salute him. They bowed with a frantic, desperate reverence. The atmosphere was no longer suffocated by the scheming of politicians. It was purified by the absolute, undeniable presence of true royalty. Alaric did not stop to remove his battle armor. He pushed open the massive oak doors of the great hall. The cavernous room was packed to its limits, but it was absolutely silent. The entire aristocracy of Aethelgard had been summoned. In the front rows, stripped of their velvet and silk, knelt the 7 lords of the High Council, their hands bound in heavy iron chains. Lord Malachor looked like a withered, terrified ghost, but Alaric did not look at the traitors. His dark, predatory gaze locked instantly onto the dais at the end of the hall. Eleanor sat upon the iron throne. She wore the midnight black velvet and the blinding gold sunburst of her ancestors. The heavy gold signet ring flashed upon her hand as she rested it gracefully on the carved armrest of the throne. She looked like a monarch who had ruled for 1,000 years. She possessed a terrifying, immaculate majesty that made the massive swords and shields decorating the walls seem trivial. She was the storm, and she had consumed the entire room. As Alaric's heavy steel-tipped boots echoed against the marble, the crowd parted for him. The nobles held their breath, their hearts pounding in their throats. The warlord had returned to find his cast-out bride sitting upon his throne. The air was so tense it felt as though the stained-glass windows might shatter from the pressure. Alaric walked down the center aisle. His eyes never left hers. He remembered the frightened girl at the altar. He remembered the phantom queen who had quietly fixed his ledgers in the shadows. And he remembered the woman in the war room who had looked at him with stormy gray eyes and promised to hold his city. He reached the base of the dais. The silence in the great hall was absolute. Eleanor did not stand. She looked down at the king, her face an unreadable mask of pristine royal composure, though her heart was slamming against her ribs. She had won the kingdom, but the only victory that mattered was the man standing before her. Alaric reached up. His large, scarred hands gripped the jagged steel and diamond crown resting upon his head. It was the crown he had fought and bled for. It was the symbol of his absolute authority. Slowly, deliberately, Alaric pulled the crown from his head. A collective, terrified gasp ripped through the aristocracy. Alaric ascended the first marble step of the dais, then the second. He stopped on the third step, placing himself just below the throne. The scent of winter frost and battle radiated from him, mixing with the heavy beeswax candles of the hall. He looked deeply into her stormy gray eyes, stripping away the conqueror, stripping away the warlord until there was nothing left but a man standing before his equal. "I left a fortress in peril." Alaric's voice resonated through the vast hall, rich, dark, and overflowing with absolute reverence. "And I returned to find my kingdom conquered." He lowered himself. The heavy steel of his armor clattered loudly against the cold marble as the King of Aethelgard dropped to one knee before the Iron Throne. Lord Malachor let out a strangled whimper. The nobility stared in completely paralyzed awe. "I swore to protect you, Eleanor," Alaric declared, his voice carrying the weight of a sacred vow. "But you protected my realm. You faced an army of 50,000 men and broke them with nothing but the truth of your blood and the iron of your spine. I once told you that I wore the crown because there was no one else strong enough to carry it." He held his steel crown out, offering it up to her. "I was wrong," Alaric whispered, though the words echoed like thunder.
The true sovereign of Aethelgard has returned from the shadows. My sword is yours. My life is yours. And this throne belongs to the true heir." Eleanor looked down at the warlord kneeling at her feet. The icy armor she had worn to survive the siege finally beautifully melted away. A profound, searing heat bloomed in her chest. He was not yielding because he was weak. He was yielding because his love for her was stronger than his pride. It was the ultimate staggering surrender. Eleanor stood up. The heavy velvet of her gown pooled around her feet. She stepped down from the throne, closing the distance until she stood directly in front of him. She did not take the crown from his hands. Instead, she reached out her slender fingers, sliding beneath the heavy steel plate of his jaw, gently lifting his head until his dark eyes met hers. "You asked me in the war room if I wanted to rule this kingdom with you, or if I wanted to take it for myself," Eleanor said softly, the aristocratic melody of her voice trembling with raw, undeniable emotion. "I told you, I did not want your crown at my feet. I want it on your head." She placed her hands over his, wrapping her fingers around the cold steel of his crown, and pushed it gently back toward him. "Aethelgard does not need a single monarch," Eleanor declared, raising her voice so the entire hall could hear the final, unbreakable verdict. "It needs a foundation that cannot be shattered by treason or time. I am the blood of Valerius, but you are the shield that held this realm together. Rise, Alaric, put on your crown, and take your place beside me, not as my regent, but as my king." Alaric's breath hitched. He looked at her entirely undone by the magnificent, merciful strength of her heart. He stood up his towering frame, casting a long shadow across the marble. He placed the heavy steel crown back upon his head, but it no longer felt like a shackle. It felt like a promise. He reached out and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. The heavy gold of the sunburst signet pressed against his scarred skin. Together they turned to face the vast sea of the aristocracy, the warlord and the true heir, power and lineage perfectly terrifyingly united. Commander Silas was the first to move. He drew his broadsword and dropped to one knee. "Long live the king! Long live the true queen!" The great hall erupted. The nobles, the generals, the terrified servants, hundreds of people sank to the cold marble floor, bowing their heads in absolute, unquestioning submission. The voices swelled, echoing against the vaulted ceilings, a thunderous roar of loyalty that shook the very foundations of the palace. Eleanor stood beside the man who had once promised her ruin, looking out over the kneeling kingdom. She had arrived in chains of deception, forced into the shadows by men who feared her light. But the shadows had only taught her how to see in the dark. The phantom was dead, and the true queen had finally come home.